They called it a ghost town that would never breathe again, poisoned soil, empty houses, a place even time had given up on. Then came a man, a war veteran carrying wounds no one could see, and a loyal dog named Buddy. He didn't buy Red Hollow to make money. He bought it hoping for a night's sleep without memories of war. But in that forgotten place, he would uncover a secret buried for 40 years, and a community once broken, waiting for someone to believe that healing is still possible. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and subscribe if you believe that hope can still rise from the ashes. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Nevada desert, a pale gold disk caught in a haze of dust and memory. Wind dragged through the sagebrush like a tired sigh, carrying the scent of rust, sand, and something half forgotten. The road to Red Hollow stretched endlessly ahead, a cracked ribbon leading towards silence. Ethan Miller, 46, sat behind the wheel of a weather-worn blue Ford truck. He was the kind of man who looked built by endurance rather than vanity. Tall, steady, handsome in a quiet way. His hazel-brown hair was short but tousled by wind, his jaw lined with a thin beard brushed faintly with silver. He wore a beige button-up shirt, sleeves rolled, untucked over dark charcoal chinos and old brown work boots. The kind of clothes a man chose when he wanted to disappear into the dust. Beside him sat Buddy, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and sharp amber eyes. A working dog's eyes, the kind that missed nothing. Once, Buddy had been a K-9 trained to find explosives. Now, he was Ethan's shadow, his pulse in 4 legs. The silence inside the truck felt earned. Ethan had left the Army 3 months earlier, after 20 years of service. Officially, a voluntary discharge. Unofficially, it was surrender in slow motion. The doctors called it PTSD. Ethan called it the echo, the sound that stayed when everything else stopped. The echo of explosions, of names shouted and never answered, of a voice he still heard in his sleep. That voice belonged to Sergeant Luke Ramirez, the man who once dragged him out of fire and dust, coughing blood and laughing anyway. Luke had been 32, all heart, the kind of soldier who made others brave just by standing beside them. In his final breath, with smoke curling through the wreckage, Luke had gripped Ethan's wrist and whispered, "Find a place where the silence doesn't hurt." Those words never stopped echoing. Ethan carried them like a compass pointing nowhere. He'd sold everything, the apartment, the medals, the furniture that never felt like home. What remained fit in the truck, a few duffel bags, a folded flag, Luke's dog tags, and Buddy. He found Red Hollow by accident, hunched over a diner booth in Utah. The waitress, Carla, a thin woman with faded auburn hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, poured his coffee and glanced at his laptop screen. "You don't want that place," she said softly. "They say it's cursed. Chemical leak back in '83. Whole town vanished in one night." Ethan looked up, his voice calm, almost tender. "Maybe ghosts are quiet." Carla didn't argue. Some silences didn't need filling. He bought it the next morning. 20 acres, 37 buildings, and 4 decades of abandonment. All for $950. When the ink dried, his signature bled slightly on the paper, like a wound sealing shut. If no one needs it, he thought, maybe I do. The road narrowed through red canyons, telephone, poles leaning like drunk sentinels. Buddy's ears twitched as the air changed. "Almost there, pal," Ethan said, his voice rough but warm. "Just a little farther to nowhere." The sign appeared at dusk. "Welcome to Red Hollow, founded 1906. The metal plate hung by one bolt, a bullet hole through the O. Beyond it lay a valley of ruins. He parked near what had once been a general store. Silence pressed close, thick and watchful. The air tasted faintly metallic, touched with the sweetness of decay. Buddy jumped out first, tail lowered but steady. He sniffed, circled, and sat. his way of saying, "It's safe enough." Ethan stepped beside him, taking in the hollow street. The gas pump frozen at $1 weight a gallon. The barber's pole long faded. The diner's door swinging open to nothing. He whispered, "Well, buddy, home sweet hell." They explored the first few buildings. The bank still held ledgers dated 1983, handwriting neat and desperate. The post office smelled of dust and paper ghosts. Every corner felt like a story cut short. That night, Ethan slept in the truck, Buddy curled at his feet. Dreams came hard, sand, sirens, Luke's hand reaching and missing again. He woke before dawn, throat tight. Buddy whined softly, pressing against his leg. "I'm okay," Ethan murmured, but they both knew he wasn't. At sunrise, light spilled over the empty windows, turning glass shards to gold. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't flinch at the quiet. It wasn't hostile. It was waiting. He made coffee on a camp stove, sitting on the tailgate. Buddy gnawed a stick beside him. Ethan took a worn photo from his pocket, Luke with his daughter on his knee, and stared until the edges blurred. "You were right," he said softly. "Quiet's harder to find than peace." Buddy perked up, ears turning toward the far end of town. Half buried in sand was a sign. Copper Creek Road, private property. Ethan frowned. That name wasn't on the deed. He folded the photo, stood, and patted Buddy's head. "Come on, partner. Let's see what kind of ghosts still live here." Buddy barked once, the sound rolling through the hollow like a heartbeat returning to a long-dead body. Ethan smiled faintly. The echo inside him eased, not gone, just quieter. And for the first time since the war, he didn't feel like running. Red Hollow sat deep within a cradle of pine, hidden among slopes that had once echoed with the sound of saws and church bells. Now, only the wind moved through its streets, a low, wandering hum, like the world remembering a tune it no longer knew the words to. The town had 8 remaining houses, all skeletal and tired. A dry well crouched in the center, its bricks split by frost and roots. A corroded sign at the entrance leaned sideways, whispering warnings in flaking paint. "Contaminated soil. Do not enter." Ethan parked his truck beside the old sawmill at the northern edge. The sign above the door, Hollow Lumber Co., was barely legible under years of rust. The last light of dusk cut through the tree line, turning the broken glass in the windows into amber shards. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and decay. He climbed out, stretching stiff legs, his beige shirt clinging to his back. The place was quieter than he'd imagined. Not just empty, but listening. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. Then, with a breath that carried more hope than sense, he whispered, "Home, for now." Buddy leapt from the passenger seat, his paws sinking into the soft dirt. The German shepherd's sable coat caught the light, showing faint streaks of silver along his neck. He was aging too, slower, calmer, but no less alert. His amber eyes swept the ghost town, as if checking for danger before Ethan could. Inside the sawmill, dust hung in the air like old ghosts refusing to leave. The floorboards were warped, the roof full of holes, but the walls still smelled faintly of cedar. Someone had once built dreams here, measured, cut, and shaped them, and then left in a hurry. Ethan set down his duffel and took in the space. "Guess it's you and me again, partner," he said softly. Buddy's tail flicked once, silent understanding. He spent the next few hours clearing a small corner near the furnace. He pried loose rotten boards, patched gaps with tarps, and laid his cot against the back wall. When he hammered nails, the echo rolled through the building and out into the valley. The first human sound Red Hollow had heard in 40 years. By the time darkness fell, fatigue tugged at him, but sleep never came easy anymore. The wind outside moaned through the gaps in the roof, and the tin panels rattled with each gust. It began softly, just wind, but in his mind, The rhythm shifted. The rattling became gunfire. The wind became screaming. The hammer he'd left on the workbench clanged to the floor, and he flinched so violently that his cot scraped against the wall. His pulse spiked. Breathing quickened. The sawmill melted away. He was back in Kandahar. Sand, smoke, Luke shouting his name, then silence. Buddy was on his feet immediately, pressing against his leg, nudging his chest with insistent force. Ethan gripped the dog's fur, grounding himself to the present, his knuckles white. "Easy, easy, boy," he whispered. "We're not there. We're not there." His body shook, his breath catching in short, broken bursts. Then, slowly, his hand found the dog's neck, the warmth beneath the fur, the steady heartbeat. That rhythm became the only sound he could trust. When the wave passed, Ethan leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Buddy's. "You're the only one who remembers and still stays," he murmured. Tears slid down his cheek. He didn't wipe them away. Maybe this, letting it happen, was its own kind of victory. By dawn, the air had changed. Mist clung to the ground, and the pines shimmered under dew. Ethan stepped outside, his shirt wrinkled, eyes hollow but calmer. The silence was no longer heavy, just still. Birds had returned, a handful of them, pecking at the earth near the dry well. For a moment, he smiled. Buddy's bark broke the quiet. He was digging furiously near the sawmill's side wall, dirt flying in rhythmic bursts. "What have you got there?" Ethan crouched beside him. Beneath a layer of packed soil, something metal glinted faintly. Together, they unearthed a small steel box, the hinges fused with rust. Ethan wedged it open with his pocket knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several photographs, black and white, edges curled, and a folded piece of paper. The photos showed people standing beside saplings, hands dirty from planting, faces bright with hope. One woman held a child beside a wooden sign. Red Hollow Rebuild, 1983. Ethan unfolded the letter carefully. The ink had faded to the color of the sky before rain. For those who still believe in rebuilding, even when no one else does. He stared at the words until they blurred. Then quietly he said, "Then we'll be the last ones to believe." Buddy wagged his tail once, the soft thump of faith. Later that morning, Ethan took a slow walk through what was left of Main Street. A toppled lamppost lay across the path. A child's tricycle sat half buried in dust near a porch, its wheels frozen in place. On one house, a faded curtain still hung, swaying gently, like someone might return any minute. He stopped at the well, peered inside. The bottom was dark, too deep to see. But for a second, he swore he heard dripping water. Or maybe it was just memory pretending to be sound. When he turned back toward the sawmill, he froze. Someone was standing by the tree line. A woman. She was tall, wrapped in a gray coat, with the collar turned up against the cold. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and the wind kept tugging strands across her face. She held a rifle slung carelessly over her shoulder, and a basket of kindling in her hand. "Morning," Ethan called cautiously. Her eyes, sharp and amber green, flicked from him to Buddy. "Didn't think anyone still came here," she said. Her voice was steady but tired, like someone who'd spoken too much truth to be polite anymore. "Guess that makes two of us," he said, brushing dirt from his hands. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Sarah Green. My family's farm's over that ridge. What's left of it anyway?" Her gaze lingered on the rusted contamination sign. "You know this soil's dead, right? Nothing grows here. Not even weeds worth cutting." Ethan looked around. Maybe it's just waiting for someone to listen again. Sarah let out a short, skeptical laugh. "You a preacher?" "No, just a man who's tired of the noise." That seemed to reach her in a place she didn't expect. For a moment, her expression softened. "If you're staying, you'll need supplies. Go down to Miller Creek, talk to Frank at the trading post. Tell him Sarah sent you. He won't cheat you, unless he doesn't like your face." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's fair." Before leaving, she handed him a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "Still warm," she said. "I bake when I can't sleep." "Thank you," he said, meaning it. She turned toward the trees. "Red Hollow used to be a good place," she murmured. "Maybe it just forgot how." And with that, she was gone, swallowed by the forest that seemed to know her footsteps. Ethan stood for a long time, watching the mist rise over the rooftops. Then he looked down at Buddy. "We'll remind it, won't we?" Buddy gave a quiet huff, settling beside him. That night, the fire inside the barrel burned brighter than before. The wind still came, but now it carried a hint of pine instead of ash. Ethan sat beside the flames, one hand resting on Buddy's back, the other holding the old letter. He read it again, mouthing the words like a promise. Outside, the forest rustled softly, and the valley exhaled, as if relieved that, at last, someone had come to listen. The morning began with whispers, not the wind this time, but voices carried up from Miller Creek, the kind that traveled faster than truth. By the end of the week, everyone within 20 miles had heard it. A crazy soldier bought the poison land, living there with his dog, talking to ghosts. Ethan didn't bother defending himself. He'd fought enough invisible wars to know that silence sometimes said more than explanation. Still, the stares came, at the trading post, at the gas station, even from passing trucks. He wasn't just the stranger who moved into Red Hollow. He was the man who thought he could fix what everyone else had already buried. When he drove into Miller Creek for supplies, old Frank watched him from behind the counter of his store. The man was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite the years, his hair a mix of white and tobacco-stained yellow. His hands were like bark, gnarled, capable. A faded tattoo peeked from under his sleeve, USMC 1972. He had the look of a man who didn't ask for trust and didn't give it easily. "So you're the one they're talking about," Frank said, weighing nails on an old brass scale. "I guess that depends what they're saying," Ethan replied. "That you bought a death trap," Frank said, eyes narrowing. "That the soil's still sick, that nothing's supposed to live out there." Ethan placed a coil of rope and 2 sacks of feed on the counter. "Then maybe I'm not supposed to live either." Frank stared at him for a long moment, then gave a dry grunt that might have been a laugh. "You're a fool, soldier, but I've seen fools move mountains before." He reached under the counter and slid a small glass jar forward, cloudy water inside. "Rainwater. Came from Mrs. Palmer. She said to give it to you." Ethan frowned. "Mrs. Palmer? Widow up on the ridge, old as dust, half blind and twice as wise. Says she remembers Red Hollow when it was still breathing." When Ethan visited that afternoon, the ridge road was lined with golden weeds and the smell of sage. Mrs. Palmer's cabin was small and leaning, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. She sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl the color of storm clouds. Her eyes, pale blue and rimmed with age, watched him long before he spoke. "I figured you'd come," she said, voice soft but steady. "You've got the look of a man who listens to the land." Ethan nodded politely. "Frank said you sent me something?" "The rain," she said, gesturing to the jar he held. "Pure, clean, from the heavens. The only water worth drinking near that cursed place." "What happened to the well?" Ethan asked, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It fed us once, then Morrison took it." "Morrison?" "Henry Morrison owned the chemical plant down by the hollow. Promised jobs, brought sickness instead. When the tanks leaked, he vanished. They buried the truth with his money. People stopped drinking the water. Then they stopped staying." Ethan glanced toward the valley beyond, now veiled in fog. "You were there?" "I was young. My husband worked the mill. He died coughing red." She looked at him then, not with bitterness, but something sadder. Resignation. "You can build your home there if you want, soldier. But don't dig too deep. Some things down there remember. Buddy sat beside the porch steps, tail still, eyes fixed on the woman as if sensing the heaviness in her words. Mrs. Palmer reached out with a trembling hand and patted his head. Good soul, this one. Dogs know what people forget, when to fear and when to forgive. That night, back at the sawmill, Ethan couldn't shake her warning. The fog rolled in thick from the pines, swallowing the houses whole. The air smelled faintly metallic. He sat near the fire, writing in his notebook, the old letter from the box tucked beside him. Day 12 in Red Hollow. I haven't seen ghosts, only my own fear wearing different masks. Buddy stirred suddenly, ears twitching. Then came the sound, faint, metallic, like a dropped wrench hitting concrete. Ethan froze. The sawmill had been quiet all evening. He reached instinctively for his flashlight, the old reflex of a soldier scanning darkness. Stay, he whispered to Buddy. The dog didn't move. Outside, the fog muffled everything. Ethan stepped into the yard, beam cutting through the mist. It landed on the outline of the old bank across the street, the one building he hadn't explored yet. Its sign, barely visible, read Red Hollow Savings and Loan. For a moment, nothing. Then Buddy growled low, not in fear but alertness. The flashlight caught something on the ground, footprints, fresh, heavy, leading around the bank's side. Ethan followed slowly, senses sharpened, heartbeat steady the way it always was when danger felt near. At the far wall, under layers of grime and ivy, he found faint letters carved into the stone, Morrison & Co., the same name Mrs. Palmer had spoken. He ran his hand over the carving. The grooves were deep, deliberate. Whoever made them wanted to be remembered, or to be blamed. Buddy sniffed the dirt, tail stiff. There was no one now, no movement. Just the bank, looming, sealed by decades of silence. Ethan crouched, studying the footprints again. One pair, boots, not his, recent. Someone's been here, he murmured. He stood there for a long time, the fog swirling around him until the wind shifted and the pine needles began to whisper again. Then he returned to the sawmill, writing one final line before sleep took him. If there are ghosts here, they're not haunting me. They're warning me. The wind carried a softer tone that morning, warm and unsure, like the valley was testing how to sound alive again. Ethan had been repairing the fence line near the well when Buddy's ears perked, head turning toward the dirt road that wound between the pines. A vehicle's engine murmured, steady and unfamiliar, until a white Jeep appeared through the trees. It rolled to a stop near the sawmill, scattering dust into the sunlight. A woman stepped out. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in khaki field pants and a denim jacket that had seen too many classrooms and too few vacations. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and a camera hung around her neck beside a leather satchel stuffed with papers. Her eyes, a light green that seemed to catch everything at once, took in the sawmill, the ruins, and finally Ethan, tall, rugged, standing beside a half-mended fence with sleeves rolled up, his beige shirt streaked with dust and effort. She smiled, cautious but friendly. I thought I was the only fool who'd come this far. Guess that makes two of us, Ethan replied, lowering his hammer. She offered a hand. Lucy Harper, I'm with Nevada State University. I'm documenting abandoned towns for a project called The Forgotten Places. Ethan shook her hand, firm, polite, with that quiet steadiness soldiers never lost. Ethan Miller, not much left here to forget. Lucy studied the land. Exactly why I came. You're living here? Trying to? Buddy trotted forward, sniffing at her boots before sitting neatly at her feet, tail wagging once. She laughed softly. Well, at least someone's friendly. She knelt, scratching behind his ear. What's your name, boy? Buddy, Ethan said. He's better at judging people than I am. Lucy smiled faintly. Then I'll take his approval as a good sign. She spent the next hour walking the site, photographing what remained, the well, the bank, the general store swallowed in vines. Ethan followed at a distance, curious but cautious. She asked questions like a historian and moved like someone trying not to disturb ghosts. At the well, she peered down into the dark shaft. "This was the town's heart," she murmured. "They said it turned poisonous overnight. Is that true?" "That's what I heard," Ethan replied. "But I've been wondering if that's the whole story." She turned to him, intrigued. "What makes you think that?" "Buddy keeps drinking from puddles after rain. Never got sick. Maybe the ground healed. Maybe it never needed healing." Lucy tapped her camera thoughtfully, then said, "If you let me, I can take a sample. I work with a lab in Reno that runs environmental analyses for old mining sites." Ethan nodded. "Do it. If we're living on poison, I'd rather know." She smiled, not the polite smile of a stranger, but the warm, determined kind of someone who believed in answers. "Then, let's find out what kind of ghosts we're dealing with." Together, they lowered a metal container into the well, pulling it back with rope until it gleamed in the light. Lucy sealed it in a sample bag, carefully labeling the tag. Her hands were precise, professional, the habits of a teacher who had once been a scientist, before the world decided budgets mattered more than curiosity. As she packed up her equipment, Ethan asked, "Why Red Hollow? You could have chosen any ghost town." Her gaze lingered on the horizon. "My brother," she said quietly. "He was a soldier. Came back from Afghanistan 8 years ago. Said he couldn't sleep. Said silence was louder than gunfire." She swallowed hard. "He took his own life 6 months later." Ethan's hammer lowered slowly in his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it more deeply than she could know. Lucy nodded, eyes distant. "So I started collecting stories of forgotten places. It helps me feel like I'm putting something back together, even if it's just memory." They stood by the well for a long moment, saying nothing. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the faint creak of old wood. The sound of something remembering it used to stand tall. 3 days later, Lucy returned. Her Jeep came bouncing down the same road, kicking up sunlight and dust. She waved a folder from the window as she parked. "You're not going to believe this." Ethan met her halfway. "Try me." "The water's clean," she said breathlessly. "Has been for years. The lab found no contaminants, no heavy metals, nothing toxic. The last recorded trace of chemical residue was from 15 years ago, long before anyone cared to check again." Ethan frowned, stunned. 15 years? Lucy nodded. "This place isn't poisoned anymore. It's just forgotten." For a long time, Ethan didn't move. The truth sat heavy. Not dark, but strange. All that fear, all those families gone, because no one had ever come back to look. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes tracing the empty streets. An entire town died from a rumor. Lucy folded her arms, looking around with him. Then maybe it's time someone brought it back to life. That afternoon, they began rebuilding the wooden footbridge over the small stream that crossed the valley's edge. Ethan sawed and hammered, while Lucy steadied the planks. Buddy ran between them, tail wagging, his barks echoing against the hills, the first joyful sound to fill Red Hollow in decades. When the sun began to fall, Lucy sat on the bridge, feet dangling above the trickle of water. Her camera rested on her lap, forgotten. "You know," she said softly, "my brother used to say something. PTSD doesn't kill you with pain. It kills you with quiet." Ethan paused his work, the hammer resting against his thigh. He wasn't wrong. "He fought for years to find peace," she said, voice trembling, slightly. "But he thought peace meant silence, and silence. It just reminded him of everything he'd lost." Ethan nodded slowly. "I came here for silence, too. Thought if I could make the world stop moving, maybe I could breathe again. Turns out," He looked at the bridge, at Lucy, at Buddy chasing shadows in the tall grass. I'm learning to listen to life instead. Lucy smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. Then maybe you're exactly where you're supposed to be. By dusk, the bridge was finished. The air glowed gold against the pines, and the water beneath it shimmered, clear and alive. Lucy crouched to take one last photo. Ethan standing on the bridge, Buddy beside him, the sawmill in the background. She looked at the image in her camera and whispered, "You just gave this town its heartbeat back." Ethan didn't hear her. He was staring at the horizon where the mountains met the sky, his face calm, the kind of calm that comes after years of noise. Buddy barked once, the sound rolling through the hollow like a bell calling the town to wake. That night, as Lucy packed her camera and prepared to leave, Ethan stood beside her Jeep. "You'll come back?" he asked. She smiled. "Someone has to write the story." Buddy trotted up and sat at her feet again, leaning his head against her leg. Lucy laughed, scratching his ears. "Guess I've already got your approval, huh?" Ethan nodded. "He doesn't trust easy." "Neither do you," she said softly. Then, without waiting for a reply, she climbed into the Jeep and drove away down the winding road. The headlights disappeared into the pines, but the sound of her laughter lingered, a faint echo that the mountains seemed to keep. Ethan stood there until the night folded around him, then turned toward the well. The stars shimmered above the valley, and for the first time, their reflection gleamed back in the water below. The rain came late that night, slow and heavy, drumming against the tin roof of the sawmill. Red Hollow had not seen rain in weeks, and the air smelled of rust and pine as the drops carved paths through the dust. Ethan sat near the fire, sharpening a chisel when Buddy lifted his head. His ears twitched, nose working the air. Then a sharp bark. Another. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, rising. Buddy stood, tail stiff, sniffing toward the direction of the old bank. The dog's fur bristled slightly, not in fear, but alertness. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and followed as Buddy trotted ahead, paws splashing through the forming puddles. The beam of light sliced through the mist and fell on the bank's entrance, the same one where he had seen footprints days ago. The front door hung crooked, half swallowed by ivy. Inside, the air was damp, thick with the scent of mold and something metallic. Buddy moved cautiously, nose to the ground, until he stopped near a corner behind the collapsed counter. His paw scratched at the floorboards, then again, faster, until the sound turned frantic. Ethan knelt. The floor gave a hollow thud under his knuckles. "You found something," he murmured. He wedged the chisel between the boards and pried upward. Beneath, a rusted metal hatch revealed itself, the handle corroded and cold. It took both hands and a good deal of effort before it creaked open. A breath of stale air rose from below, the kind that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Ethan shone the flashlight down into the darkness. A set of narrow stairs descended into the earth, carved from stone and lined with old conduit pipes. He hesitated, then looked at Buddy. "Stay close." The descent was slow. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell of damp metal became. At the bottom, the light revealed a small chamber. Walls of concrete, lined with filing cabinets and collapsed shelves. Water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic taps. Ethan wiped grime from one of the cabinets. The label read, "Morrison Chemical Holdings, Internal Records." He pulled the drawer open. Inside lay folders swollen with moisture, the ink fading but legible. He flipped through pages, shipment logs, payment receipts, employee rosters. But at the bottom of one drawer, he found something else. A journal bound in cracked leather. The words Mayor Elijah Green embossed faintly on the cover. He sat on a broken crate and began reading by flashlight. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, entries written during the final days of Red Hollow's life. "The company insists the water is safe, but the children are sick. Morrison's men threaten to cut funding if I report it. I fear the truth will die with this town." Another entry, dated a week later. They've sealed the plant. They say cleanup is underway, but there's no one left to clean. Morrison begged me to stay silent, said the land could recover. Perhaps he believed that. Or perhaps he simply couldn't face what he'd done. Ethan read until his throat tightened. The mayor had not been complicit. He had been cornered. The truth had been buried along with their shame. He turned another page. The ink here was smeared, almost unreadable. If someone finds this, remember us not for what broke, but for what we tried to build. Ethan closed the journal, his fingers trembling slightly. The silence down there was absolute, thick, like the world had been holding its breath for 40 years. Then, a soft creak. He turned. A piece of the ceiling groaned under weight. The flashlight beam caught the movement, dust cascading in slow motion. "Buddy, out!" he shouted. The dog barked once, then lunged up the stairs. Ethan followed, but a crack split through the ceiling as a beam fell behind him. The sound was deafening. He stumbled, catching himself against the wall as plaster and concrete rained down. Buddy appeared at the top of the stairs, barking madly, teeth bared as if commanding him upward. Ethan pushed through the dust, coughing, pulling himself into the open air just as the floor behind him gave way with a roar. He collapsed onto the wet grass outside, gasping, mud smeared across his arms. Buddy pressed against him, licking his face anxiously. "I'm okay," Ethan managed between breaths. "Good boy, you did it." He lay there for a long moment, rain mixing with sweat, the taste of earth and iron on his tongue. When he finally sat up, he looked toward the collapsed entrance. The old bank stood silent again, but something inside him had shifted. He retrieved the journal, its leather cover dark with moisture, and set it beside him. The firelight from the sawmill glimmered faintly through the rain in the distance. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, maybe Morrison wasn't evil. Maybe he just couldn't bear to face the truth. Buddy whined softly, resting his head on Ethan's knee. Ethan looked out over the valley, where fog rolled low over the rooftops. "If they buried this because they feared being forgotten," he said quietly, "then I'll remember for them." By morning, the rain had washed the dirt clean from the main street. The bridge stood firm, and the well overflowed slightly, clear water glistening under the first sunlight. Ethan placed the journal beside the well, weighed down by a stone, as if giving it back to the town. Sarah arrived from the ridge just after dawn, drawn by the smoke from his fire. She looked around, puzzled. "What happened?" "Found something under the bank," he said, voice tired but peaceful. "Proof, not ghosts, just people, scared ones." Sarah studied his face, streaked with mud, eyes calmer than before. "And now? Now we tell the truth," he said simply. She smiled faintly. "You're starting to sound like a preacher again." Ethan shook his head. "No, just someone who's tired of silence." Buddy barked once as, if agreeing, his tail thumping against the damp earth. As Sarah walked with him back toward the sawmill, sunlight spilled through the pine canopy, catching the rain still dripping from the branches. Red Hollow shimmered faintly, like the valley itself was listening. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, journal open on his lap. He read the last line again. "Remember us not for what broke, but for what we tried to build." He traced the words with his finger, then closed the book and looked toward the stars. "I will," he whispered, and for the first time, the silence of Red Hollow no longer felt empty. It felt like memory, alive and waiting. The first snow of the season came thin and sharp, falling like ash over the ruins of Red Hollow. It was the kind of morning that carried silence heavy enough to break a man's thoughts. Ethan was stacking firewood beside the sawmill when he noticed the sound of an engine. Not Lucy's soft Jeep, not Sarah's old pickup, but something louder, angrier. A black truck rolled into the valley, tires crunching over gravel and frost. The driver stepped out first, a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool coat with the collar turned high. His hair was the same shade of iron gray as the sky, his jaw lined with stubble that made him look both worn and defiant. His name, Ethan would soon learn, was Cal Morrison, the son of Henry Morrison, the man who had once owned the chemical plant that destroyed Red Hollow. Behind him came 3 younger men, Ryan, wiry with nervous energy and a shaved head, Dale, heavier built with kind eyes that seemed out of place among the anger, and Luis, lean and quiet, his face half hidden under a hood. They carried crowbars and rusted shovels, but not the kind meant for work. Cal's voice carried across the cold air. "You're the soldier living on my father's graveyard." Ethan set down the axe, slow and deliberate. "Didn't know the land still belonged to anyone." "You're spreading lies," Cal said, "telling folks my father poisoned this town." Ethan met his stare calmly. "I didn't tell anyone anything. The truth was buried before I got here." Ryan kicked at the ground, his breath fogging in the air. "We heard you've been digging under the bank. My uncle said you found something." Ethan didn't answer. The silence was enough. Ryan's anger cracked first. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Digging up the dead to look good on the internet?" Ethan's tone stayed level. "I'm not here for that," Ryan sneered. "Yeah? Then why the hell are you here at all?" Buddy growled softly, stepping forward until he stood between Ethan and the group. The men tensed. Cal raised a hand. "Stand down. We ain't here to shoot your dog." But his voice shook slightly, not from fear, but the strain of holding too many ghosts. Ethan could see it now, the resentment, the inherited shame. Cal wasn't here because of hate alone. He was here because the truth about Red Hollow had reopened an old wound. "Your father didn't destroy this town alone," Ethan said quietly. "He was told to stay silent. I've read the mayor's journal." "Liar!" Ryan shouted, and before anyone could stop him, he kicked hard at one of the rotting support beams of the sawmill. The crack echoed like thunder. The beam gave way. A heavy crossbar above snapped loose and came crashing down, striking Dale's shoulder and pinning him beneath splintered timber. Chaos erupted. Luis yelled, "Dale!" and tried to lift the beam, but it was too heavy. Ryan froze, pale, the rage in him collapsing into panic. Ethan was already moving. "Back up!" he barked, voice sharp, commanding, the soldier returning. "Give me space!" Cal grabbed Ryan by the arm, pulling him aside. "Let him work!" Ethan knelt beside Dale, checking his breathing. "He's still with us." His tone was focused, clinical. "Buddy, light." The dog darted to the truck, grabbed the flashlight Ethan had left on the hood, and brought it back in his jaws. He dropped it beside Ethan, tail steady, eyes alert. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, looping his belt into a makeshift tourniquet and tightening it above the wound on Dale's leg. "Luis, I need a lever. That iron bar." Luis grabbed it, hands shaking, and shoved it toward him. Ethan wedged it under the timber. "On my count. 3, 2, now." The beam shifted just enough for Ethan to drag Dale clear. Blood streaked his sleeve, but his voice stayed calm. He pressed his palms to the man's chest, counting compressions. "Come on, breathe." Nothing. He pressed again, harder. Then Dale coughed, a wet, gasping sound that turned into a ragged breath. Ryan fell to his knees beside him. "Dale, hey, you're okay, man. You're okay." Buddy stood close, panting, watching the scene with those steady amber eyes that always seemed to understand more than any human could. The wind howled through the broken sawmill. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Cal said quietly, voice breaking, "You saved him. You saved my man." Ethan wiped his forehead, leaving a streak of dust. "On the battlefield," he said, "we don't ask who's right. We just save whoever's bleeding." Cal looked at him, really looked, for the first time. And something inside the man cracked. The years of bitterness drained from his face. replaced by a raw, uncertain gratitude. "Maybe I've been fighting the wrong ghosts," he muttered. Ethan didn't reply. He just nodded once, a soldier's nod, the kind that said, "We understand more than we say." Buddy, still standing near Dale, pawed at something beneath the debris. Ethan followed the motion, brushing aside ash and splinters. There, half buried, lay a rusted metal sign. He turned it over. The words glimmered faintly under dust and light. "Red Hollow Foundry." Ryan squinted. "What's that?" "The foundry," Ethan said softly. "This used to be the place that built everything in town. Tools, fences, even hope." He set the sign down gently. Maybe it still can. The silence that followed wasn't hostile this time. It was reflection. Cal rubbed his neck, voice low. "We didn't come here to destroy anything. We just didn't know what to believe anymore." Ethan stood, stretching his sore arm. "Then maybe start by believing and fixing what's broken." Cal nodded once, then turned to Ryan and Luis. "Get him to the truck. We're done here." Ryan hesitated, eyes wet. "Sir, Go," Cal said. They loaded Dale carefully, driving away through the fog. Ethan watched the truck vanish into the trees, the exhaust trail curling like smoke from a fire that might finally be dying out. The next morning, the sound of engines returned. Ethan stepped outside, wary. But this time, the men were unarmed. Cal stood at the front, gloves on, shovel in hand. Behind him, Ryan, Luis, and Dale, pale but upright, arm in a sling, carried lumber and tools. Ryan called out, "We owe you. Let us help rebuild this place." Ethan studied their faces, rough, honest, humbled. Then he nodded. "All right, but we start where it fell." They set to work. The rhythm of hammers and saws rose through the valley. Buddy darted between them, tail wagging, barking each time a nail went straight. For the first time in decades, the sound of men working filled Red Hollow, not as laborers, but as builders of their own redemption. By sunset, the frame of the sawmill stood again. Cal wiped his brow, looking toward Ethan. "This place, it's more than my father's shadow now." Ethan leaned against a post, tired but content. Red Hollow was never about one man's mistake. It's about what people do after. Buddy lay at his feet, eyes half closed, the faintest sigh leaving his chest, the sound of a dog finally resting in peace. And that night, when the firelight danced against the new wood, Ethan wrote in his journal, "Day 32. Today, I saw hatred turn into grace. Maybe this town isn't haunted by ghosts anymore. Maybe it's haunted by second chances." Winter melted slow that year, as if the valley itself was learning to trust the sun again. The snow receded from rooftops and revealed the bones of a town that no longer wanted to die. Red Hollow had begun to move, not with noise, but with purpose. Hammers echoed where wind once wept, and laughter began to settle between the walls. Ethan stood at the edge of the sawmill one morning, hands on his hips, watching men carry lumber. Cal Morrison barked orders with a voice that carried pride instead of anger. His coat sleeves were rolled up, and his once clean hands were calloused now, cracked with sawdust and forgiveness. Ryan led a group of local boys, mostly young men who had lost jobs when nearby mines closed. They worked with stubborn determination, even when the nails bent or the beams split. Luis had turned out to be a skilled welder, and Dale, still walking with a limp from the accident, managed the supply list with the patience of someone who understood second chances. Sarah Green was back too, her gray coat fluttering like a flag of persistence. She carried baskets of bread from her rebuilt farm, feeding the workers with quiet smiles. When Ethan teased her about becoming the heart of logistics, she rolled her eyes. "You rebuild towns, I rebuild stomachs." But the biggest surprise came when Lucy Harper returned, her white Jeep bouncing down the familiar road, camera mounted on the dash. She waved from the driver's seat, excitement glowing across her freckled face. "Project Hollow is officially approved," she shouted before even stepping out. Ethan raised a brow. "Project Hollow?" She grinned. "A joint community program, PTSD therapy through craftsmanship, teaching veterans and unemployed locals to rebuild historical towns. You're the prototype, Miller." Cal chuckled. "So, we're part of a government experiment now?" Lucy smirked. "If it works, maybe the government will finally learn what hope looks like." The following weeks blurred into movement. Lucy organized workshops inside the refurbished sawmill, now called the Foundry again. The sign Buddy had unearthed hung proudly above the door, polished until the letters gleamed in sunlight. Inside, they built tables and benches. Veterans from nearby counties drove in, some limping, some quiet, all carrying the same hollow look Ethan once wore. They worked in silence at first, shaping planks, sanding edges. But as the days passed, silence gave way to conversation, and conversation gave way to laughter. Buddy became something of a supervisor, trotting from station to station with a solemn air, tail wagging when someone completed a frame correctly. He wore an old red bandana Lucy had tied around his neck, faded from years, but still bright enough to be noticed. The men started calling him Sergeant Buddy, and he took the role seriously, barking if anyone dropped a tool or forgot their lunch. One morning, Ethan was showing Ryan how to fit a door frame. The younger man wiped sweat from his forehead, frustrated. "It's crooked again. I can't get the angle right." Ethan steadied the plank and said, "You're forcing it. Let the wood breathe, then guide it." Ryan grunted. "You make it sound like the wood's alive." "It is," Ethan said, tapping the beam gently. "Every nail you drive in, every frame you fix, it's a way of saying you're sorry. And if you keep doing it long enough," he handed Ryan the hammer, "it becomes forgiveness." Ryan looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "I'll keep hammering then." Lucy filmed that scene from across the workshop, not for publicity, but because it reminded her of her brother. That quiet transformation of pain into purpose was what she'd hoped to find when she began the Forgotten Places. Now, she was living it. Later that week, a few townspeople from Miller Creek came by to watch the progress. Most were curious, some were skeptical. Among them was an older man named Tom Weaver, tall, thin, with a sharp voice that carried across the yard. He pointed at Ryan. "Isn't that one of the Morrison boys? The same family that poisoned this valley?" The worksite fell silent. Ryan froze, hands still on the hammer. Cal stepped forward, but Lucy reached him first. Her tone was calm but firm. "You're right," she said. "His family made mistakes, but he's here fixing what was broken, not hiding from it. If Red Hollow can be saved by the son of the man who ruined it, maybe that's what real justice looks like." Tom opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. The others murmured in agreement. Ryan looked down, cheeks flushed, but there was a new steadiness in his eyes. Not shame, but pride earned through pain. After the crowd left, Ethan approached Lucy. "That was a good speech," she shrugged. "It wasn't a speech, just truth." He smiled faintly. Truth tends to sound like hope when it's said by the right person. That evening, as the sun fell behind the ridge, the valley glowed gold. The rebuilt sawmill, the repaired bridge, and the growing gardens shimmered under the light like a painting slowly restoring itself. Ethan stood on the porch with Cal, watching Buddy chase a stick through the yard. "You ever think it'd get this far?" Cal asked. Ethan shook his head. "Didn't even think I'd stay this long." Cal smirked. "Guess Red Hollow had other plans for us." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the town's heart, the well that had once been a symbol of death, now overflowing with clean water. Children from nearby towns came to play there on weekends, their laughter echoing off the hills. Sarah often stood nearby, handing out sandwiches and stories about the town that refused to die. Lucy, notebook in hand, wandered among the workers, jotting down names and dreams. Her documentary camera hung from her neck, but lately she used it. Less. Some stories, she said once, are better told by the people living them. That night, Ethan wrote in his journal beneath the lantern's warm glow. Buddy slept beside him, paws twitching in a dream. He looked out at the quiet valley, alive with the sounds of rebuilding, saws humming, voices trading jokes, hammers beating like heartbeats. He wrote, "Peace isn't the absence of people, it's when no one gets left behind." When he closed the journal, the wind carried the smell of pine and sawdust through the air, the scent of renewal. Buddy stirred, nudged Ethan's hand, and rested his head against his leg. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, boy, it's starting to sound like home again." And as the stars rose over Red Hollow, the town breathed, not as a ghost, not as a wound, but as a living thing reborn through grace, forgiveness, and the stubborn hands that refused to give up. 2 years passed, and Red Hollow no longer looked like a ghost. The morning sun rose over a town reborn, windows gleaming, chimneys breathing thin trails of smoke, laughter replacing echoes. What was once a valley of silence now carried the rhythm of hammers and prayer. On the first flag day since the rebirth, the people gathered in the square. The wooden sign over the main gate read, "Red Hollow, a home for the broken and the brave." Ethan stood near the flagpole, wearing his old beige shirt, sleeves rolled, the creases faded by work and weather. His beard had turned grayer, but his eyes were steady, clear, the eyes of a man who had traded ghosts for purpose. Buddy lay at his feet, muzzle now white, his once bright amber eyes clouded with age. Yet, when the flag rose and the wind rippled through the valley, the dog lifted his head, as if remembering every nail, every step, every heartbeat that had rebuilt this place. The sawmill had been renamed Buddy's Workshop, not by Ethan, but by the townsfolk themselves. The sign, carved from cedar, hung proudly above the door. Inside, the rhythmic clang of tools was joined by low laughter and the murmur of veterans teaching others. The smell of oak and oil mingled with coffee and fresh bread. It had become more than a workplace. It was therapy made tangible, where hands that once held rifles now built doors and tables for the homes around them. Across the square stood the restored church, its white paint gleaming under sunlight. The cracked bell had been recast in steel at the foundry, and when it rang, its sound carried far through the hills. The church had been renamed the Center for Healing and Hope, its pews replaced by long tables, walls lined with paintings and letters written by veterans and their families. Each note told a story of survival and of the stubborn grace to begin again. Behind the church stretched what used to be a field of weeds. Now it was called the Garden of Second Chances. Rows of vegetables and flowers grew under the care of Sarah Green and a team of volunteers. Sarah herself had aged beautifully, her once dark hair now streaked with silver, her sharp eyes softened by contentment. She worked the soil like a hymn, her tall frame stooping over tender shoots, the sun bronzing her freckled skin. She smiled when Ethan passed. "We're finally feeding the living, not the dead." Cal Morrison arrived that afternoon, wearing his work jacket and a proud grin. In his calloused hands, he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. He knelt before the memorial stone in the square, the one dedicated to the lives lost when Red Hollow fell silent. Among the names was his mother's, and beneath it, a new inscription: "Forgiveness built this town." Lucy Harper stood beside the podium, camera ready but eyes glistening. She had chosen not to film today's ceremony. "Some moments belong only to memory," she had said. The crowd hushed as she stepped forward, her auburn hair catching the wind, voice clear and steady. "2 years ago," Lucy began, "this valley was a wound, a place abandoned because no one dared to look at its scars. But Red Hollow did not stay dead. It breathed again, because people who were once broken refused to stay that way. Because a soldier came here not to fight, but to listen. And because love, in its quiet, ordinary form, remembered what hate forgot. She paused, scanning the faces of the people she had grown to love. Cal, Ryan, Dale, Luis, Sarah, and Ethan. The man who had taught them all that peace could be built by hand. Red Hollow once died from being forgotten, she continued softly. But today it lives because kindness was remembered. Applause rippled through the crowd. The church bell rang once, deep and full, echoing across the mountains. Ethan stood apart, watching quietly. He had never liked crowds, but today was different. He felt no weight in his chest, no tremor in his hands. Just stillness. The good kind. A young courier approached, hat in hand. "Mr. Miller, sir. Letter for you." Came from Washington. Ethan frowned slightly, taking the envelope. The government seal was embossed in blue. He broke it open and read silently. It was an offer. Red Hollow to become a national rehabilitation model for PTSD recovery, funded by the Department of Veterans Affairs. They wanted him to lead the program. Ethan smiled faintly, folded the letter, and slipped it into his pocket. "Maybe someday," he murmured. Then, glancing at Buddy, he added, "But not today." Buddy blinked up at him with those cloudy eyes, tail thumping weakly against the dirt. The old shepherd lay beneath the oak by the workshop, the same tree where he and Ethan had once camped their first night in Red Hollow. Ethan crouched beside him, running a hand through the thinning fur. "You see it, don't you, Buddy? We did it. We taught them how to live again." The dog let out a soft sigh, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. The air was warm, filled with the hum of saws, the clink of hammers, and laughter carried from the gardens. When dusk came, the townsfolk unveiled a small wooden sign beside the oak tree. The carving was simple, made by Ryan himself. "Supervisor Buddy, the one who brought us back." Lucy wiped a tear and whispered, "He earned it." As the sun dipped below the hills, lights flickered on in every window, soft, golden, steady. The sound of tools, laughter, and music blended into a single melody that filled the valley. Ethan stood by the gate, hands in his pockets, looking at the sign overhead. Red Hollow, a home for the broken and the brave. He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush his face. For the first time in years, he didn't hear gunfire in the distance. Only life, vibrant, loud, imperfect, and whole. And somewhere in that chorus of sound, the ghosts of Red Hollow finally laid down, their rest. They said miracles don't happen anymore, but maybe miracles aren't lightning in the sky. Maybe they're the quiet human kind, the kind that begins when a broken soldier chooses to rebuild instead of retreat, when a town long forgotten chooses hope over fear, when a loyal dog simply refuses to give up. Red Hollow was never about wood, stone, or steel. It was about people, scarred, tired, yet still willing to lift one another from the dust. Ethan found peace not in silence, but in laughter shared beneath new roofs. Cal found forgiveness in the weight of a single flower. Lucy found meaning in the faces of those who refused to be defined by their pain. And Buddy, faithful, steadfast Buddy, became the bridge between wounds and healing, between what was lost and what was possible again. Maybe that's the miracle we keep missing in our own lives, that redemption rarely arrives in thunder or glory. It shows up in hands that build, in neighbors who stay, in the choice to love one more time, even when the world says it's foolish. So, if you're watching this tonight, wherever you are, pause for a moment. Look at the people around you. Offer kindness. Build something, even small, because somewhere in the quiet corners of your life, God is still writing his miracles through ordinary hearts like yours. May this story remind us that faith still rebuilds, love still heals, and light still returns, even to the darkest places. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help more souls find hope again. And as you do, may God bless you and your family with peace, courage, and the grace to keep rebuilding. one act of kindness at a time.